Now, the news from Libya continues to be tragic. 2 photographers and numerous civilians are the latest deaths to be reported in a conflict that as yet sees no end. Meanwhile, France, Italy and Britain have said they'll be sending small teams of military officers to advise the rebels who aim to topple Colonel Gaddafi. Well, one of his greatest advocates is his daughter Aisha Gaddafi, often referred to as the Claudia Schiffer of North Africa. She's made a number of appearances in public asking for support for him, so how significant an influence is she? I'm joined by Nabila Ramdani, a freelance journalist who specialises in the Middle East, and Harriet Sherwood, who's covering Libya for The Guardian. She's in Tripoli. Harriet, you saw her address a rally the other night in Tripoli. What was her message?
Her message was uncompromising, I would say. She was speaking on the 25th anniversary of the bombing of Gaddafi's compound in Tripoli, following the Libyans' alleged bombing of a Berlin nightclub. And she described the current bombing campaign by NATO as NATO bombs raining down on the heads of my and your children. She said that talk of her father stepping down was an insult to all Libyans. And her essential message was, we will never give up.
Her adopted 4-year-old sister was killed in 1986 in the bombings by the US. What effect does that seem to have had on her in the way that she's speaking about it now?
Well, I think it's had a huge impact on her life, and she has set up various charities and foundations in her adopted sister's name. She's well known for campaigning for women's rights in Libya, but currently her message is not so much about women's rights and civil rights. It's about ensuring that the regime continues.
Nabila, how significant are these more frequent public appearances that she's making?
I think they're very significant in the sense that she's trying to show that the Gaddafi family is very much united. It's very much a unified clan against the divided West. We're seeing the divisions within the NATO coalition, for example, and it's also a way to show defiance towards the West. But I think it might sound laughable, but I think perhaps more crucially, Aisha's appearances are certainly significant because they're a clear attempt to present a feminine, a maternal view of the regime, which has largely been, which has been wholly lacking over the past 42 years. And let's not forget that Aisha is a young 34-year-old mother of 3. And by putting her forward, Gaddafi is clearly trying to soften his political image, if not his military one. And he believes that the face of an attractive, educated Arab woman might have a positive effect in time of crisis. And I think it might work for some Libyans, but I don't think she's had much of an effect at all overseas.
Harriet, what was the atmosphere at that rally? How was she being received?
Well, ecstatically is what I'd say. I mean, I think the atmosphere was, to me, it felt cult-like. It was a mix of a rock concert, a football crowd, and a political rally. Thousands go to Gaddafi's compound in Tripoli every night to act as human shields against NATO bombardment. And I spoke to one woman in the crowd. There were hundreds of women there, segregated to one side, but many of them beautifully made up under their headscarves. It was like a night out. But one woman said to me, "I love Gaddafi more than I love my husband." The crowd was really on side with Aisha. Her speech was constantly interrupted by chanting, by people pumping their fists in the air, cheering, singing, shouting. It was an extraordinary sight.
How important, Nabila, is that degree of support for him?
I think it's quite important in the sense that he's quite comfortable in finding himself again in the position of the hard man defying the West again, the isolated pariah. And the fact that he's using, his a very glamorous young woman to try to unify people around him is very important, because he's also able to rehash the old discourse, the old rhetoric about the West being a threat to his regime once again.
She seems a very complex character. You know, she's highly educated, she's a lawyer, she appears very westernized. I mean, this Claudia Schiffer is not misplaced. She's very, very beautiful and very, very well groomed, wears designer clothes, and yet her speeches are vehemently anti-Western. How does she square these things?
She's indeed very well educated. She completed her first degree at Al Fatah University in Tripoli, and then she moved to Paris to complete a PhD in international law. And her work very much focused on the third world against the legality of the United Nations security, which essentially argued that Western organizations like the UN were exploiting poorer countries. She played a crucial role.
Was she not a UN ambassador for a goodwill ambassador for a while?
Until recently she was indeed, and she was joining celebrities like actresses like Angelina Jolie or Giselle Bundchen, for example, the model, until the infamous speech made by her brother Saif Gaddafi, promising rivers of blood running through the country. So at that point she was not able to carry out her mission as a UN goodwill ambassador. But she, I think the turning point was when, after the invasion of Iraq, when she made a public statement saying that she didn't believe in international law anymore, and that, in fact, it was a regression from the effort she'd made in the past, for example, to reach out to the West. She very much was involved in convincing her father to give up his program of armament in chemical weapons, nuclear weapons, for example.
She worked as a lawyer in defence of Saddam Hussein. Why did she do that?
That's perhaps her most controversial role so far. I think she was very much convinced that she was much more involved in research work, in putting his case together. She didn't actually go to court, but he was a family friend, and his regime had been threatened in the same way that her father's regime could have been threatened in the future, and we're seeing how it is the case now.
We read, Harriet, or we hear about pressure coming from within the Libyan government on Gaddafi to stand down, to move aside. They say, you know, if we have talks with the rebels, then we will pressure. How much pressure do you think he is actually under to stand down?
It's hard to tell. I think that, publicly the regime is very united, but I do think you can see chinks. I spoke to the new foreign minister, Abdulati al-Abaidi, the other evening, and he told me that the regime was willing to consider free elections within 6 months of the end of this conflict. He said everything is on the table, and said that they were considering whether Gaddafi could stay or whether he should retire, which was an interesting thing. And I've had lots of conversations, private conversations, with people close to the regime who do say, we know that things have to change. Some go even further and say, we know it's over. We know that Gaddafi has to go. They won't say this publicly, but I think that there are moves from reform-minded people within the regime who are trying to find a way through the current crisis, and who privately acknowledge that will probably involve Gaddafi stepping down at some point. But they say it won't. They can't accept it as a precondition for a ceasefire.
But Nabila, given the kind of historical response that Harriet described at the rally, and the people saying they love Gaddafi more than they love their husbands, how much is Aisha bolstering that support for him, which will keep this war going?
Well, I think she's very awkward in the way she's trying to bring about support around her father. If there's not the slightest admission that it's wrong to have one man ruling the country for over 4 decades now, she's very much preaching, dare I say, the old-style cult of personality. There's no concession there. There's no. She's not saying, for example, that her father will disappear from the political scene. She's defending what is currently, a not credible position.
Nabila Ramdani and Harriet Sherwood, thank you both very much indeed for joining us this morning.